as Megan said, I'm the director of the Idaho Housing Authority, and I've been the director there for going on 8 years now. And a series of events a few years ago kind of set the motion for what we have tonight. So a few years ago, I was in my office and decided to step out the back door and get some fresh air when I noticed some billowing smoke that was coming from the corner of our property. And so as I went to the corner of the property to see what was going on, my maintenance staff had dug a rather large hole with a backhoe and were burning boxes of archive stuff, just burning it. And that's the thing, as maintenance guys, right? They need places to stick greasy stuff on shelves. And so I was able to salvage the vast majority of it, but I lost a lot of information between about 1987, 1990, somewhere there, to the more current year. What I was able to say was everything from 1939 to 1990, which is fortunate because when I started this endeavor of writing this book, there were so many people who said, I've got stories and I'm writing my book, but they never did. So one of the things that I did was I had all of the information that I pulled out of this hole digitized by an archivist over in Boise. And he gave me a call one afternoon and asked me how I wanted this information presented, or how I wanted to present it. And I said, why don't you put the information in date order from earliest to latest, and subcategorize it by financial information, by administrative record, by meetings, board meetings, by correspondence from the government to the government. So I just, after my youngest, I had 2 older kids that are out of the house, but after my youngest went to bed, I would start reading through these chronological orders from 1939 to current. And what I realized that there was a great and remarkable history at the Idaho Housing Authority, or what most people know as the Idaho Labor Camp, or the Farm Family Labor Camp, or if you're Latino, El Campo. So there's many different names for it. And so if I drift back and forth between Farmway Village or Caldwell Housing or the Labor Camp or the Farm Services Administration Labor Camp or El Campo, please understand that we're talking about the same place. But as I put this administrative history together, one of the things that I learned was that during a time in our country's history, the New Deal program attempted to correct many of the things that were wrong with our country at the time. And there was this really obscure administration called the Relocation Administration that attempted to relocate about 1 million people from the impoverished areas in the Midwest to some of the more western cities that were doing a little bit better. Well, the name Relocation Administration wasn't received with too much favor, and I can probably see why. So after a few months, it was changed to the Farm Securities Administration. And so the Farm Securities Administration was an organization that was specifically set out to make sure that our farms were getting the support that they needed in order to thrive during the Depression. So part of the New Deal program was to create these labor camps. And they had built 96 or 98 of them. I can't remember. I just wrote the book. I'm expecting to remember what's in it. But they built these labor camps. And what was supposed to happen is people were supposed to be able to drive in their 1930 coupe 35 miles an hour for 10 hours a day and get to the next labor camp. And they were able to go from the Midwest to the East Coast, and along the way stop at these labor camps and work a few days and get a little bit of subsistence and then be able to move on. And so the labor camps really became a place where many of the people who were displaced during the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression had a place to land for a little while, had a little chance to be normal. And so I suspect, or I hope, that many of you in here, at least in high school, if not in your college days here have read the Grapes of Wrath, John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. And we all know that the Joad family traveled for quite some time after their baby to a labor camp. And if you remember, Miss Joad was extremely happy that they had running water. This was the first place that they'd ever lived where they had a toilet to flush. And so this is true with the labor camp that is out in Caldwell. So as the history of the labor camp evolved, it was first for people who were displaced during the Great Depression. And then during World War II, there was a shortage of farm laborers, and the United States, and specifically Idaho, was under orders from the United States government to double its output of certain agricultural products, double their output of sugar beets, corn, for the war effort. And because there was that doubling of the size of farms in this local area, there was a necessity for additional laborers to work on the farms. We found those laborers during the 1942 to 1945 era. We found those laborers at the Minidoka internment camp. So the federal government, who was actively engaged in turning people, in about a 6-month period after the federal government mandated the doubling of the output of crops, had an about face that these people, these Japanese people, who were first generations to be born here, were looked upon as people who were going to destroy our irrigation systems, and they needed to be interned. But a few months later, we decided that we were going to give them an opportunity to show their loyalty to this country by allowing them to work on local farms. So from that standpoint, there was about a 3 or 4 year period where the labor camp in Caldwell was primarily occupied by Japanese people as an alternative to internment, not as an alternative. And I'm not going to talk much about the history of that, although if I was dealing with a different group of people, I would certainly direct the conversation with them. The other thing that happened during World War II was that the Mexican government decided that they were going to support the war efforts, not by providing soldiers or combatants to the war, but they were going to provide farm laborers to move up into the United States to help with the production of agriculture. And so what I'm here to talk about tonight is specifically the Bracero program and what the Bracero program in Idaho did and its influence on helping create the rich diversity that we have here in Southwest Idaho. I just got done speaking with a group of Southwest Idaho genealogy. And one of the ladies said after my presentation, well, I never knew why there were so many Mexicans here. And so I was like, well, now you know. And so what I hope to do tonight is to be able to explain to you maybe one of the reasons why we have such a rich and diverse culture here. And then hopefully open your minds to be able to think about some things that you have around you. So from somebody here not too long ago, it might have been Dr. Burke, that said, Mike, I consider you the foremost expert on things relating to housing authority. And it brings me back to a time when I was out of college and working for the city of Boise. They sent me off to Washington, D.C. for 2 weeks in a statistics class, and a little micro MBA statistics class. Because the government accounting office has a specific way that you're supposed to do statistics in order to make sure that you represent what you're doing with your data. And so as I was back in Washington, D.C., there was a Georgetown professor who had this little sign above his chalkboard, and it said, an expert is somebody who knows more and more about less and less until they're absolutely worthless. And so I never want to be called an expert. Now, having said that, I did go to dinner with a guy and he couldn't even calculate the right tip. So, as somebody who teaches graduate level statistics, he's probably true in his assessment. So one of the things I want to be able to do is just tell you a little bit about the Bracero program and just hopefully open your minds to think about the community that we live in. So the Bracero program led probably about 1 million Mexican laborers from Mexico coming to the United States to work in the agricultural industry. And that program, the official Bracero program, was between 1942 and 1948. There were many other guest worker programs that went well into the late 60s and early 70s. But the official Bracero program was only for a short time period. During the early years of the Bracero program, the Mexican laborers that came to the United States ended up working in the railroad. They needed to get the United States, in order to win this war overseas, we needed to get our military might to the coast. And so how do we get that? We build more railroads. And we ship things on railroads to the coast and then on the ships overseas. Once the war started winding down in the latter part of the Bracero program, many of the intended Mexican laborers ended up actually on farms in America when they were destined to in the first place. So I have a couple pictures up here, and you can see that the Bracero, if I step away from the microphone, you're not recording from the microphone, are you? So as you can see, the Braceros, they used to line up and to go to a point in Mexico where they signed up, some information was taken, and they were then sent into America in different areas. And one of the things that I learned in talking with the community, a older gentleman here who live in this community, they said they remember the Braceros coming to Texas, to McAllen, Texas, and to the southern Texas area. He said they would bring them in trucks and trains, and they would put them in fenced-in enclosures like cattle. And the farmers would go around, and they had this weird way of selecting people, almost like they were purchasing produce. They would say, "You're really short, so you would be good picking things off the ground. And you're really tall, so you're going to go to the orchard, so we'll put you in the orchard." And I thought that was kind of an odd thing, that we would treat people that way. And then I started, and I often wondered if it was true. He says this as a young man, he remembers this. But then I found some other pictures and some other work done. I apologize for not citing the report, but this picture right here has a gentleman with the United States government who is checking the hands of the Braceros who are signing up. He wants to make sure their hands are well worn and there's calluses on them. Because if they weren't well worn and didn't have calluses on them, they questioned whether or not they knew how to work. And so many of the Braceros that came to this country came with a certain knowledge of our agricultural industries, of their agricultural industries. And in the long run, and as a subject for a different discussion, helped quite a bit in developing the agricultural practices that we have in this area today. I gave this presentation, and George Crippen of Crippen Seed Company sat through the whole presentation and didn't say a word. When it was over, he came to my office and I purchased a large number of books and said, if it wasn't for the Latino workforce that we had here, many of our agricultural practices that we have wouldn't be here. So not only did they come and help, but they also came and helped with the innovation. So each of the Braceros, as they came to this country, they were given an identification card, and each state, once they got their official identification card from the government, then the state might have issued them a different identification card. And I think if you see up here in the corner, it says alien identification card, alien labor identification card. And so as long as they had their alien labor identification card, they were free to come back and forth between Mexico and the United States and to work in the agricultural industry. There is a gentleman who lives out at the housing authority today who has one of those cards, one of those original cards, and I have asked to purchase it from him, but he doesn't want to part with it, and probably for good reason. But throughout the history of the Bracero program, many people came to the United States, and just in case you go home and decide to Google Bracero. I understood that Bracero meant strong arm. I'm not reading somebody else, and somebody says Bracero means strong labor. And then somebody else says, oh, the Bracero meaning strong back. And I thought, well, how could it be such a variation in what it is? But then I thought, if I knew a different language, how would I describe a lumberjack? You know, so the Bracero just basically meant a worker, a laborer. So there's a lady in Nampa named Verla Harker, and her father was the manager of one of the mobile labor camps that was set up in Nampa. Now the mobile labor camps were all based out of the Caldwell labor camp, and they were put away for the winter time, and then during the summertime they were taken out and they were set up. And so one of the things, and I don't know if you guys can see that very well, but one of the things that Mr. Harker did, every time the Braceros got off the bus, he took a photograph. And so this was one of the many photographs he took of the Braceros that got off the bus to work for a season in Nampa, in the Deer Flat area. And just in case you didn't know, Lake Lowell was also another New Deal project. So if you look up here at this photo, and I'm going to step aside here and point to some things with the laser pointer. You'll see a couple things in this photo that are really, really important to this discussion. So as you look here, these people are pretty, they've got their farm clothes on, they've got their work clothes on, whatever they have. This gentleman right here, he has his guitar. And this gentleman right here has his fiddle with him. And then this gentleman right over here has his guitar with him. So when we think about things that cause people to migrate, in today's news, we know that people in Syria are migrating because they're taking refuge of the Civil War. And we probably have people in the Philippines who are starting to migrate out of necessity from the typhoon that hit them. But for the Braceros who migrated, they brought their culture and they brought their customs with them. They didn't just come here to work. They knew they were coming here for a while, and so they brought those things which helped them embrace their culture. So the Bracero program was a program where young men, most of them were single, but those who were married, they came unaccompanied, and they stayed here for a while. So this next picture is another group of Braceros 3 years later, and we see from the first year of 40, 50 Braceros, there were 3 instruments. Now, a couple years later, we've got a whole bunch of people with instruments. So of the 40 or 50 that came, what do we have? We've got 6, 50, 1, 2, 12 of them that brought their instruments with them. And so, as they came back, they more and more started bringing their culture with them, and more started to create their own environment where they were beginning to thrive and flourish. Then it just got to the point where they were having all sorts of parties and fiestas, you know. You bring people in here and you expect them to work, and the next thing you know, they're having fun. Then let them listen to a radio and let them listen to the old, boxing, and now they want box, So the thing about the Braceros, even though they came, they intended on working hard. They also wanted to play hard and to enjoy their culture. One of the other things that's important to notice about this picture here, and something else that's important within the context of this discussion, is look at the clothes that they're wearing. Pretty nice khakis, pretty nice white shirts. If you look at the pictures when they arrived, they came in ragged and ratty clothes. By the time that they were here for a while, the time that they stayed, they were also very interested in improving their social station in life. Right? Get a little money, you want a little better clothes, maybe you can buy a boxing glove. So in 1946, about 1,000 Mexican workers in Nampa went on strike. Because the thing about the Bracero program was a contractual arrangement between the United States and Mexico, where the Mexican laborers were supposed to be paid the prevailing wages. They were supposed to have their medical care tended to. They were supposed to have food and transportation, and working conditions were not supposed to be any more deplorable or any harsher than those of the people native. So what happened is many of the farmers didn't live up to that. Where the prevailing wages might have been 70 cents an hour, they were only paying 50 cents an hour. Who's going to brag about that? I mean, really, what's the course of action? You don't like it, you go home. And so the Mexican workers went on strike. And they went on strike for about a 3 or 4 day period, demanding better pay, demanding better treatment, and they got none of it. They actually returned back to work after a couple of days with no change in the current situation. However, the strikes that happened in Nampa and other strikes that happened throughout the United States forced the Mexican government's hand in looking into the way that the Mexican workers were treated in this country. And so when they came to the labor camp, called the labor camp, they had noticed that the conditions were pretty bad. That many of them were sleeping on hard ground, on concrete, didn't have adequate blanket or didn't have adequate bedding. That the food that they were eating was not customary with their diet and the types of food that they ate. There was no medical care, and the pay was substandard. So Mexico was outraged, not only by Idaho, but by many of the other programs throughout the United States. So they ended the Bracero program. So in 1948, the Bracero program ends, and all Mexican workers are asked to return to Mexico. So for those of you who are feverishly writing things down, between 1954 and 1967, it is estimated that labor brokers brought 17,000 Mexican workers to southwest Idaho and eastern Oregon. So the Bracero program ends, and it ends because the Mexican laborers are treated poorly. So why do you think in the following years that so many people came to southwest Idaho? Somebody's got an answer, right? Why do you think?
Still work.
What's that?
There's still work.
It's still work. Poverty in America is better than poverty in Mexico. So, I threw this in there, and I apologize. It should have been in a different place. But I put this in there because I like the khakis and the shirts they were wearing. Just because, you know, it's like, hey, Mom, look, I came from America. Now I've got some things. So sorry for being out there. Why do people come to Idaho? Oh yeah, my wife takes pictures of birds and she feeds goldfinches, right? So let me digress a little bit. So and it's weird because between like August and January she doesn't feed the goldfinches. It's like her punishment, right? So she just lets them just do anything. But in January she hangs out these things that are called Niger socks, and goldfinches eat a Niger seed, really tiny. And she hangs it out in January, and she waits to see how long it takes for a bird to come. And then she watches over a period of time that it's one bird, and then two birds, and then 5 birds. And then she gets amused by the fact that the males will fight at the top of that Niger sock and rip it open, and all the females are on the ground picking up everything that the males are fighting over on top. And so, and then she feeds them through August, and then we stop, and we start this brutal process all over again. So when we think about migration, I think about the migration that happened in this area here. I think about one person saying, yeah, it's okay to come to work tonight. You know, it's really not that bad. Or 50 cents an hour is still better than no cents an hour. It is still work. So let's take a look at some of the things throughout the world here. These are the Mexican slums in 2010. Can you imagine what the Mexican slums were in the 1900s? How about the Haitian slums or the Indian slums from this year? They're pretty bad living conditions. And then take a look at United States public housing in 1978. Even in 1978, the conditions of housing are better than most of the world has today. So when you think about poverty in other places, poverty in America is a lot better than poverty in other places. So that was probably the main reason why there was the migration that we had in the late 50s and early 60s of the Mexican laborers. And when I talked with people, I'm trying to think. Let me back up a little bit. When I wrote the book, I wrote it in administrative history, but it was completely empty of the personal aspects of the housing. So the back part of the book is all testimonials, and those testimonials that are in there are just some of the hundreds of testimonials that I took from people. And so one of the things as a social scientist, somebody who stats, is you make reasonable assumptions based upon the information that you're able to collect. So from the information that I was able to collect from many of the people who were the early migrants here, they said the Caldwell labor camp was far better than the house that they lived in McAllen, Texas. And so when you combine the fact that the housing that they lived in at the labor camp was better than where they came from, there's a pretty good reason why people migrated. The other thing that happened was during that time in Texas and Oklahoma had decided to grow a different type of an onion, a sweeter onion, and it was a smaller onion. And that onion was primarily made for processing for dehydrated food. And so if a laborer had to bend over 100 times to pick a bag of onions, you know, that may have been worth 50 cents or whatever. Now they had to bend over 180 times or 200 times. So the labor was more demanding for no more pay than they got. So now all of a sudden you combine the fact that the conditions of labor are changing in the southern part of the United States, and the housing conditions over in Idaho are better, and you have a pretty good recipe for people to migrate. And the migration probably couldn't have happened without the help of many people like Mr. Nava, the gentleman on the left. The gentleman on the right is his brother, who remained in Texas, but Mr. Nava would go back and forth to Texas every year and bring laborers from Texas to Idaho. Idaho was still in a place of expansion in its agricultural industries. We had been forced to expand our output of sugar beets and corn and other crops during the war. How are we to maintain those? Many of the people who fought in the war were now moving inland into the more urban areas, jobs that were created through the Industrial Revolution in the war. And so places like Amalgamated Sugar and Crookham, they would pay these labor brokers $20 per head to bring hard laborers from Texas. And so now all of a sudden you have somebody brokering people, somebody in in the business of collecting people. And, you know, back in 1960, if you got $1,000 for bringing 50 people to Idaho to work, that was probably a good chunk of money. And so there were many labor brokers. One of them is still lives in Mora's dad, Ozuna, and a couple others that I speak about in the book. And they each had their own specialty. Mr. Nava brought people in by the truckloads to work in the sugar beets and in the cornfields. Mr. Ozuna, he did not have the big contracts at the big farms, so his work was more specialized. He would bring laborers in and would market their skills. This guy's a welder, or this guy's a mechanic. And so rather than putting them in, you know, these laborers in the dirt, he put them in shops and maintenance shops and part of the administrative operations of the farm. So, well, a lot of labor brokers who played a large part in bringing those 17,000 Mexicans to South. You know, Idaho today still, its main economy is its agricultural industry, and even though we think it probably hasn't changed over the years, it has. Idaho no longer grows produce. You see there a gentleman by the name of Homer Gomez, he's got cantaloupe in one hand and green beans in the other. And that's what he did. He picked cantaloupe and he picked green beans. The other thing that's important to note about this is that the agricultural community, up until the mid-1980s when child labor laws changed under the Fair Labor Standard Act, it was okay for kids of 10, 11, 9 years old, 8 years old to work on the farm. And the way that it worked is that a labor broker would go to a farmer and say, give me $1,000 for, you know, blocking these beets. And so if the labor broker did it with 100 people, then, you know, it was $10 per worker. If he did it with 60 people, then it was a little bit more. So it was important for the families, and we just talked about this a little bit at the table as we were sitting here, that bootstrap mentality. Hey, I worked in the fields and I worked here 12 hours a day and my hands were blistered and cracked, and you have no idea, no idea what it's like. We still see this today out at the housing authority, where I will ask some of the kids, some of the bright kids who are involved in the 4-H program, whether or not they plan on going up to the University of Idaho's 4-H summer camp, and they'll say, I can't, I'm going to work in the field with my parents. And so many times, I think our young kids at the Caldwell Labor Camp miss out on an opportunity for being exposed to higher education because they are expected, like their parents are, to work in the fields. And even though I think that is a good work habit for people, one of the things that I think we ought to be concerned about in this area here is that a young person's first $40,000 investment shouldn't be in a car that's worth $0 after 5 years. Their first $40,000 investment should be in their education, which is never taken away. And unfortunately, when you live in a rural community, an agrarian society, it's always that bootstrap mentality. This is the way I did it, and if I were you, I would do it this way. I'm notorious for opening a bunch of windows and then not closing them. So if I started sending something and I forgot to come back to it, let me know. And if my wife was here, she'd be yelling at me. So I do that all the time. This is a lady here by the name of Idaho, and she came to Liberty in 1953 as a young girl. And I should have brought a potato belt because I do have one, but if you see they wear a belt and it's got these two large hooks on them, and they load those hooks up with burlap bag, and they walk around, one person picks the potatoes, the other person puts them in the bag, and then as they go, they just drop these bags on the ground, and then a truck comes by and picks the bags up and stacks them. Anyway, she worked in the fields for a while, and then she got a job at the housing authority, and she ended up working there for 33 years and retired. And the first day on the job, she came in and she sat down and she said, "Mike, I just want you to know that people are going to accuse me of stealing money when I leave." And I said, "I don't care. Why?" And so as the conversation went on, as she persisted, she told me that she had lived at the labor camp her whole young adult life and still lived there as she was working there, and deposited her paycheck but never accessed it for more than 35 years, and had $500,000 in savings. She lived very modestly off of what her husband made working at Crooks. And so as we also talk about migration too, it's also important to note that many of the hard work habits from some of these people who were here also means that they're industrious and that they're frugal, and that one day many of us will probably be working for them because they have a business acumen. And it's funny because I interviewed her son and her daughter in the process of writing the book, and every year Ida would take, when her kids were young, Ida would take her 2-week vacation and take her children to work in the fields. And they would work real hard, and at the end of the 2 weeks, when they said, "When are we getting paid?" she would say, "Mijo, there is no money in farm labor." And so the kid, they remember mom coming home and saying, "Oh, I put in for my vacation," and they would bawl for 3 or 4 days because they knew they were going to go to work in the fields. And so now both of them have their master's degree. One of them works at HP, and the other one works for Coca-Cola. And so, you just talk about, what some people expect, to work in the fields, and other people say no. Learn from others. So there is rich diversity in the experiences that many of the Latino folk. Here's that same lady out of the labor camp, my day. She graduated high school. And she was really one of the first people that people who grew up in the 70s and 80s really looked up to. They really looked up to her. Something else was happening. Oh, yeah, okay, so I have to shift gears. Maybe the next slide will remind. So the other thing that people migrate for? Better health care. Amparo, very lovely lady, still lives in Caldwell. One of the first Latinos to graduate from Boise Junior College, and has a family. And she came to this country from Mexico and received absolutely no medical care in Mexico for polio. All the medical care that she received in this country. And that was another thing with regards to the migration and why people were so happy or so satisfied with coming to this area, is that even though the medical care wasn't the most advanced, there was medical care. And also, for those of you who have ever had the opportunity to listen to former Governor, the Honorable Mr. Batt speak, will know that Mr. Batt and his farms out in the Notice and Wildwood area provided porta potties and water to farm workers long before they were required by state law, probably about 20 years longer than they were required by state law. So many of the people in the agricultural industries, Crookham, Simplot, the Batt farms, they realized the importance of labor, and they realized the importance of a shift from white people doing farm labor to Latinos doing labor, and really did quite a bit to reward them, to praise them, to give them the accolades necessary. something else was happening. So this is what would happen is the migration to this area would start at about Easter time. So many of the families got here right around Easter, a week before. They said that their parents would like to be here before Easter, and they'd like to be home, wherever home was, Texas or Mexico, before Thanksgiving. And so when they said before Thanksgiving, then we knew that they were from Texas, because Thanksgiving is an American thing. It's not a country thing. If they said they wanted to be home before, I can't remember the holiday, it was the holiday where they dress up as skeletons on their face. What is it? Day of Dead, yeah. They wanted to be home before the Day of Dead. Then we knew they were going back to Mexico. So it was kind of this, you could tell by how they were talking, where they were migrating from and where they were going to. But while they were here, things started happening. Like Rose Archuleta, the lady there off to the left, started teaching catechism. And so now the kids that didn't see each other between November and January and February were all of a sudden back together again. And when they were back together again, they were a group. And in my book, many people talk about, not seeing their friends, and were so excited because they never knew from year to year whether or not families were going to come back to the same labor camp. But how they were really excited when they came. The other thing that happened is the labor camp became a place known as home. And the book is called A Place to Call Home. And as you talk with many of the people, they would say, we knew if we went on a date, our girlfriend rode in the back seat. And we knew that our hands were on the steering wheel. We knew we drove under 5 miles an hour. And we knew we were out of downtown Caldwell and downtown Manville by dark. And we knew when the football game was over, we left. But we also knew when we got home to the labor camp, it was home. And we were all treated the same. And we were all poor. And we were all treated the same. So when some of these families would migrate and would pull into town at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, other families that were already there would get up in the middle of the night to make tortillas and make dinner for the families who were arriving. So it was this really comfortable place where everybody knew it as home. And so when you talk about people who have fond memories of this place, yeah, it was home. Texas was a place where we went in the winter, but home was the labor camp. And that's where we felt most comfortable. And then the catechism just grow and grow, and so people are starting to get enculturated into this way of life here. And this is funny. Does anybody find that migrant Mexican dressing up like Indians for Thanksgiving funny? Anyway, I just thought it was, because now all of a sudden these people who are migrating are now enculturated the American way. They're celebrating our holidays. And oh my word, they're dressed in bail-bound pants and they're dressed. And then they want to be rock stars. And we build a library for them. And they open their own store and their own supermarket. And this is where they live, in these little places that are far better than the conditions that they lived in. So when I don't hope anybody takes it like refer to them as them, because that's, I think that's in our culture today. A lot of people look at people who are Latino and they don't disseminate between those who are here legally and illegally. And I still think as a culture, we still say them or they or whatever. Actually, they're really a part of us. But I say that because as they migrated, as they came here, they picked up and they became part of us. They became part of our culture. They became part of us. More pictures of houses. Here's some of the houses. housing out there today, some of the old housing that's been destroyed. And then this one I put in there on the left-hand side. The Filipino guy in the front is the Mateo. That's him on the right-hand side. He moved out to the labor camp in 1955 and did not return to the Philippines until 1985. He lived at the labor camp for 30 years, and he never went home. And every bit of money that he made at the labor camp, he sent home. So his 3 kids in the Philippines could get a college education. And so I just always think it's a neat story, so I threw it in. And this lovely lady is Cecilia. She is the 3rd generation to live up there, and she is raising her daughter as the 4th generation to live there. Now, it's just like any other place. You know, we have kids everywhere. So, you know, I don't want to take too much more time, but to just kind of you know, recapturing what we've talked about here. Working in Southwest Idaho as a migrant worker wasn't that bad. It wasn't bad compared to the conditions they came from. So the laborers kept coming, and they kept coming, and the next thing you know, they were an integral part of our community for the better. And it's just been an honor and a pleasure speaking with different people about it. And it's been kind of fun being expert of sorts about the book. So, yeah. Does anybody have any questions? Or anybody, did I open any window that I forgot to close?
Can I pose a question?
Sure.
So you talked repeatedly about this idea of and the sort of reality of the fact that life in the migrant camps was often better than the life back home. And yet, I also see a danger in some of that uplift narrative because it could possibly, and often is, I think, used as a justification then to maintain systems of inequality. And so, if you can speak to that, and then even maybe bring that around to some of the and maybe this out of your purview, so you don't have to.
Sure.
But things about like the DREAM Act and some of those discussions as well that have some of that tied up in it.
Yeah, sure. I have. I don't know if I can answer your question as you. But I'll try. But you're right. That's one of the things that did happen throughout the history of the labor camp. They embraced their culture. They were home where they were home, and so the signs in Caldwell and Nampa that said "No Mexicans or no dogs," they were allowed to stay. Nobody can. I mean, kids go home. You know, we don't want you here. And so most of the Latinos, they knew where they could go to buy their food. They knew where they could go to get their haircuts. And so they stayed away from those other establishments. And I think for a long period of time, it did perpetuate that sort of racism or that segregation. And I think we still have that today, and I alluded to that just a little bit. We live primarily in a conservative state here, and for those of you who have been around this area for a while know that here several years ago, we had a county commissioner who wanted nothing printed in Spanish. That everybody who was going to apply for services needed to do it in English. And we didn't want to provide. And so I think that further perpetuated that notion that if you are of brown skin, you don't belong here. But in reality, nobody can tell the difference between who's legal and who's not legal. And I've even said in other venues before that I think this term legal is now almost a new N-word of our society, and it saddens me. Now, with regards to the DREAM Act, I am fully aware that there is enough room in this great country to facilitate many people who want to be here. Hopefully one of these days our leaders will come together and realize that immigration reform is necessary and it's needed. And I often think of the political spectrum not being something left and right, but something being circular. Where why can't we bring the extremes of both ends together and say, how do we make this work? And for those of you who don't know, if you are 2 years old and you are brought to this country and you graduate graduate from high school, you have stayed here long enough to become a criminal in the United States. A young girl, 20 years old, got married here in America, brought here at the age of 2, went to Mexico to go through the legalization process, and at the border, when she went to go back to Mexico, was arrested by U.S. officials as a criminal. And that's what happens to everybody who tries to go through the legalization process. Now, one of the things I'll tell you, and I don't tell many people this, is that my parents are immigrants. They're immigrants from a country that people were white. And they never were subject to the hatred and to the racism. They just happened to come to this country from Russia via Germany. And so I mean, and I say that because I think we take a look at people who are of different color, and still deep down inside it, you know, some of the areas of this country, we're still hard down with it. So anyway, probably didn't answer your question, but you're right. Allowing them to live under those conditions and having it thrive so that perpetuated the first third division.
Could you maybe just speak a little bit more, people making approach visually, about the South Texas versus Mexico difference? Because I know the classes I have are a little bit aware of that, because we read a book by a woman who was from South Texas, right? So there's a long time culture going back sometimes before the war between the U.S. and Mexico, and then there are people who come from Mexico directly, so that any commentary you have on.
Yeah, I don't know that I have much commentary, but I do know people from northern Mexico and southern Texas. They had a long connection to each other, and you know, we think about the Civil War that we had here, where you know, brothers and cousins were shooting across fields at each other. I mean, that's basically what it was in southern Texas and northern Mexico. Cousins and relatives who were basically isolated by a geographical boundary. And so many of the people that came and worked in this area were from the southern Texas area, and many of the people who came back then didn't have a way of, didn't have a computer to look them up, you know, and to see whether or not Jose Sanchez is really from southern Texas or northern Mexico. And so I think that's why the Amnesty Act in the mid-'80s by Ronald Reagan was such a popular thing, because those that traveled to this country from the northern Mexico area into southern Texas and the rest of the United States were such a large group of people.
So earlier you were talking about the different people who would bring vendors up here. They would bring either they was up for agriculture or for bringing them into the mechanics and such. Did that make a difference in how much success they made?
You know, that's a good question. I never really looked into that. And I don't know whether or not any particular story or anecdote stands out as any answer that I can give you. I would think that the people who were probably put in the machine shops as mechanics, either at Simplot or Kirkland, they probably enjoyed a longer work season because of the off time, the equipment and stuff ready. And I'm just guessing based upon my own knowledge of farming and the way they work. But I don't think it had any impact on their success. I do know that a number of people that I talked with and spoke with, and it was almost an interesting side note to my research, was that some people hated the stigma attached with working at the labor camp or living at the labor camp. And so for every 9 people that loved it and thought it was home, there was one person that said, I don't like it. I hated every minute of it. Because we weren't in the college. I wanted to go to a big high school, but the housing authority wasn't integrated into the local school system until the early 70s. So there were some people who who didn't like it. And for those who didn't like it, the people who did like it and had great things to say would always ask that question, well, have you talked with so-and-so? Well, don't talk with them because they really want us. And you kind of go, okay, well, thanks.
Could you tell the valedictorian story and then
Okay. So there was a lady who was to graduate, and someone quote that if I get the date wrong, don't say bad things about me. I think it was 1980 or 81, and she had gone to the college schools, and she was to be the valedictorian. And the day of the commencement ceremony, she was called in to the office, and she was recognized for her outstanding achievement in the 4 years of high school in the Caldwell school systems. But unfortunately, she would not be recognized at the commencement ceremonies as a valedictorian. And she left. She left the Caldwell schools with this bitter feeling, and she never said anything about it until she was interviewed for this book. And even though there were many people who were embittered by the way they were treated in town, whatever was installed in them in their community and their ethics and their way of life as a larger ethnic community, they were really okay and were over it. You guys got a question?
How does the Caldwell Housing Authority work today?
How does it work?
Yeah.
Well, today, we are still under orders from the federal government until December of 2028 to provide preference to farm laborers. And there is a diminished need for farm laborers across this country for several reasons. So in 1980, it required 11 farm workers per 1,000 acres. In the year 2010, that was 1.5 farm workers per 1,000 acres. And so, and that's in large part because of mechanization, bioengineered seeds, a whole bunch of different reasons where farming is just more efficient. So because there is a diminished need, we have temporary permission from the government to allow people who are low income to live at the housing authority. So even though it's predominantly filled with Hispanic people, about half of them are still employed in some manner or fashion in the agricultural industry, maybe not directly farm labor, but we are seeing a more and more of your low-income white applicant. And nothing prohibits that. I mean, we can't discriminate on the basis of race, religion, color, and the 8 protected classes. But when you think about who was doing the farm labor, well, during the war, it was the Japanese people, and after the war, it was the Mexican people. So when you have farm labor housing, who lives there? Primarily the people who work in the farms. So, and I think that trend is still there today. I mean, even though there is still farm labor, the vast majority of them are your Latino or Mexican households.